Hello, and welcome to HeartSense's The Pulse, where we tackle pressing issues in healthcare. Today, we will discuss the issue of cultural relevance in cardiovascular care. Why is it important? What impact does it have on health equity? What can we do to transform how we view medical education, and how can we make that more inclusive? Today, I'm joined by our HeartSense founder, Dr. Antoine Keller, and our special guest for today, Dr. Travis Batts. Dr. Batts is the Chief of Cardiology and Chairman of Medical Subspecialties at Wilford Hall Ambulatory Surgical Center in Lackland, Texas. Dr. Keller and Dr. Batts, welcome and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello,
Thank
Sabrina, and
you.
hello, Dr. Batts. It has been a long time I've been wanting to get you to come on the show because we have so many very provocative topics to talk about and so many things that are currently applicable to the practice and the educational aspects and the professional aspects of cardiovascular medicine that it really is important for young people, especially who are thinking about going into cardiovascular disease management, to understand where we are and where we've been so that we can try to improve upon what we have and look forward to making progress in the future. So it is an honor for us to have such an esteemed guest, and I really appreciate your commentary and your thoughts about these very important topics. Thank you for coming.
No, thank you. And again, I appreciate those kind words. But as you know, I mean, it's one of those things where any mission or any purpose that is of true value can't be done alone. So I'm glad you've allowed me to be a part of the HeartSense team. I mean, I've had some the opportunity to kind of look at some of the work you're doing, and it's hard to keep up. Every day there's a new post on Twitter or something that you're doing to help the community to enhance, kind of those three E's: education, educating, energizing and engaging the community in a way that is substantive and sustainable. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm ready. I'm ready to get going.
Excellent. Well, we're not going to shy away from things that are controversial today because I think it's important for us to have these discussions about questions and topics and comments that people have that might not necessarily be said in a public forum. So I encourage you just to tell us how you feel and what's in your heart, and I will do the same.
Agree.
Okay, well, let's get started. So, Dr. Batts, let's start with telling the community about who you are, what are your current positions or affiliations, and also what motivated you to want to become a doctor or a cardiologist.
All right. Now this is where I get to have a little fun, and Dr. Keller may kick me off. Do you want me to be truthful or honest? And people always say, well, what's the difference? Well, sometimes the truth hurts. So I'll ask that question. Do you want the truthful answer or the honest answer?
I want the
Oh,
cold hard facts, the
yeah.
Oh, you
truthful, honest
okay. Well,
answer. I
well,
want
well,
it, and I
first,
want to know the story behind the story too. So don't be shy.
okay.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
all right. You asked for it. So for me, I always enjoyed a challenge, right? Always enjoyed it. And fast forward through high school, playing sports and going to a Division I college, realizing, man, these guys are really fast. And I ran track. And so from there, I looked at it as an opportunity. So I majored in biochemistry, understanding that what I wanted to do was something that integrated not only my love for health and wellness, but also my enjoyment of sport. My first research project was to develop, creatine, a different type of creatine. It had better absorption. Needless to say, I'm not a millionaire developing creatine, and so I had to pivot. And I worked in the pharmaceutical industry while I was in undergrad, but it done so well in sales that I moved up very quickly and was actually managing a region, teaching other people how to sell, how to market pharmaceutical sales. And so I went into an office and I was friends with this physician and I was talking. I said, well, I just don't feel fulfilled. And I said, you know what? I think I might go to medical school. And he paused and looked at me and said, eh, I don't think so. You're great at sales. Medicine wouldn't be for you. So at that point
Hmm.
in my head, I said, okay. I'm going to prove you wrong. So I go back to University of Kansas and say, hey, put me in some classes to be a doctor. This lets you know how much I did not know about that process. And sure enough, they said, no, you don't understand. It's a whole nother school. And I said, well, give it to me. So the university, shout out to the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk Jayhawk, they helped me through that process. And fast forward to me getting to a medical school interview. And this is where the story it gets a little interesting. So I'm sitting down, and it's an older gentleman across the table. He has glasses on his nose, patches on his elbow, and he's so Dr. Batts, what made you get into medicine? And I heard the people before me, my father, this person, they had all this legacy of medicine. And I asked him the same question I asked you all. Do you want me to be truthful or honest? And he said, the truth by all means. I said, well, all right, don't throw me off after this. I said, I wanted a pretty wife and tall kids. And there was this odd
Man.
pause. Exactly.
Oh,
Yeah, you weren't expecting that.
okay.
And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, when I went to college, I thought I'd be playing professional sports. I'm not the tallest guy, but I wanted a pretty wife. I want my kids to be. He said, that is the dumbest answer I've ever heard.
Mm.
But you're so honest, we want you on board. I said, what? It worked. And it
Wow.
worked at every medical school, because what he said was the fact that you could come in and say that, but still produce on paper, still do all these other things, let us know.
Mm.
And I mean, and I fell in love with the university. I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And there I really
We
had the
won't hold that
opportunity.
against
What? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. That is the backdrop. My friend down the road. But and then from there, it was really just embracing cardiac physiology first. I just love the heart, meaning it is probably, and I say this, and some people get mad, some people, it is the simplest organ. It only
you.
can go
Mhm.
wrong in one of three ways. It can either
Yeah,
be a
yeah,
structure problem, it can
yeah,
be an electrical problem, or it can be a plumbing problem. That is it.
yeah.
I don't have to think about diffusion ratios and all this stuff that nephrology.
That's
I don't
really
have to think.
ironic that you say that, because I had the same feeling when I was in medical
Yeah,
school.
it is so. I said, man, so all I got to do is fix one of these or find out what's wrong with one of these. And when that happened, I did consider CT surgery. I thought they were the coolest people. They would go in, save the world, throw a couple instruments, do their theatrics. But CT surgeons are good people.
I don't know
But
anything about that.
But it wasn't until I was in a case, and it was a long case. It was like, it was a complex congenital case, just too many pieces. And we were there for 10, 12 hours, and the surgeon was still into it. For me, once I get in and we fix, I hate close. So I'm like, oh, but I have to stand here and be
Mhm.
interested and ask the questions. So we finished the case. I'm in my scrubs. I'm sweating, and I see one of the cardiologists walk past, and he's got on slacks and some loafers, and he's looking at me, and he's
Gucci,
like, "Hi."
everything, right? Uh-huh.
Yep, he had everything right. And at that time, he said, I just opened X amount of artery. I think it was 5 arteries, had lunch with my wife. Now I'm heading home. Good luck. And at that point, I said, you know what? Maybe I can look at cardiology. But it was just that physiology of the heart that kind of
Mm.
drew me. And in cardiology, there's so many different ways you can vector. I ended up settling on prevention and sports cardiology. So I'm a preventive sports cardiologist, meaning I get to deal with the super healthy fit. And at the same time, I get to see people who unfortunately have suffered the sequelae of coronary disease. And I think that dichotomy allows me to appreciate things just like we're doing here, talking about bias and disparities in health. And as you know, this month is Minority Health Awareness Month. So I think our discussion is very apropos in the sense where we're highlighting some of the systemic issues that impact it. So I know that was a long road to get to where we are, but that's why I became a cardiologist, so to speak.
Well, that's fantastic. I think that people so often ask me about why I became a doctor or why I wanted to be a doctor. And a lot of them have aspirations of being doctors. So it's important to give them tools that they can use to be able to show people that their love of medicine and cardiology or cardiac surgery is genuine. And I think your story highlights the fact that you have to do you, and you have to give people an honest impression of who you are and why you want to do what you want to do. And it's really important for you to know why you want to do what you want to do so you can describe that to them, because there are very smart people who want to do what you do. Almost everybody is smart who wants to go to medical school. And everybody's talented, and everybody has a story behind why they want to go to medical school, but not everybody has a legacy of medical school. And I think
Right.
that is another really important point about your story is that you didn't have a daddy or a granddaddy or a grandmother who were doctors. You didn't know anybody who was a doctor. And so there are a lot of people like that because there are so few minority physicians in America. You know, a UCLA study recently showed that we have the same proportion of African American doctors in America now as we did more than 40 years ago.
Exactly.
So it's a crisis situation because our population is growing faster than any other demographic group. About 20% of the people in this country will be over age 60 by the year 2035. So it's
Mhm.
something that we have to get ahead of. And the best way for us to do it is to encourage more young people to go into medical disciplines and specifically cardiology and cardiac surgery because that's what we like to do. So we're going to start it off. Sabrina's going to ask some questions that are very provocative questions that I think people want to know how they should approach these questions and what kinds of answers they should give. So I encourage you to give us the same candor that you did about your doctor story with how you have been explaining to people about bias and what that means and about all the kinds of cultural issues that impact people in their cardiovascular care. So go ahead, Sabrina. Let's get started.
Okay, so we'll take it away. So our second question is specifically about cardiology. So we'll start with a statistic that only 4.2% of cardiologists are Black,
Mm.
but 60%, 60, of Black people have heart disease in America. So, having said this, what implications does this have for health equity, considering this statistic? And also thinking about the fact that there's also plenty of African Americans that aren't counted in that percentage that have that significant family history.
No, I think that's a wonderful question, but it forces us to um, almost think of a second question, right? Meaning, well, does race matter, right? Cornel West had a book, Race Matters, right? And when we think about healthcare, we think, well, it shouldn't, right? Especially in cardiology, it is a binary decision tree. You come in with heart attack, you get fixed. Well, we know, unfortunately, that that's not true, right? And if we take data from women, we know that women that present to the emergency room with similar symptoms as a man have an 11-minute longer wait time in the setting
Mm.
of a heart attack, right? You say,
Wow.
well,
Mm,
we were talking about African. Well, Dr. Keller and I had a discussion several weeks ago where we talked about who gets referred for valve surgery. Aortic stenosis. He has a group, and I hope I can say that is working on identifying valve disease before you have symptoms, which is great. But what it means is that you have to have some other inflection point. You have to have someone like Dr. Keller to do it. Well, you just said there's only 4% of Dr. Kellers and 60% of people have issues. So race does matter. So once we establish that supposition, then the question comes to speaks to what, how does it impact it? Well, it impacts it in the way that oftentimes when you identify folks that have a similar background, that have a shared lived experience, and that oftentimes can connect on levels that you might not find in a HeartSense, which is the big book of internal medicine, or you might not find, in a DeBakey, surgical book, right? But there are certain things that would trigger a thought, a pattern, an emotion that might allow you to identify that patient before they have their event. It's one of those things where if you wait to catch someone while they're falling, they're much heavier, as
Mm.
opposed to just helping them stand. And I think that's what this construct of, implementing strategies to improve racial diversity in the physician pool, particularly in cardiology. Again, Dr. Keller, your thoughts?
Yeah, so that is the main focus of our HeartSense program is to try to understand how to figure out what we don't know. And we know that we have certain prevalence statistics that are bandied about in cardiovascular disease, and Black people have higher prevalence of most every cardiovascular disease, whether it's stroke or coronary disease or heart failure or atrial fibrillation. The only one that the literature says Black people have a lower prevalence in is structural heart disease or valvular heart disease. And so, how can you expect that Black people die at rates of cardiovascular disease death that are almost twice as high as a lot of other groups, but yet they have half as much structural heart disease? It doesn't make sense. And so we tried to analyze why this is so, why the literature is indicative of the fact that people feel that the prevalence of structural heart disease in the African American community is less. And most of the data that we have about prevalence comes from incidence data. So that means someone has been to the hospital and has been found to have a certain problem and has had some therapy for that problem. Well, one of the things that we found with our HeartSense program is that so many patients with cardiovascular disease in underserved communities, whether it be Black communities or Hispanic communities or rural communities, don't go to the doctor until they get heart failure. So we don't know that they have valvular heart disease. And so you can't make an adequate determination of prevalence that is unbiased if you're using bias as one of the main components in your equation. And the incidence data is biased because these people don't go to the doctor, so we don't know that they have come to require treatment for their problem. So if you have garbage in, you're going to have garbage out. So if you don't have an adequate representation of incidence, you won't be able to find out what the prevalence is. So that's our main mission. And I think it speaks to the fact that in order to be able to encourage people to go to the doctor and to find out when people have cardiovascular disease that is structural before they actually have symptoms becomes eminently important. And so this speaks to Sabrina's question, which is so we have 13 or 14% of the population, which is African American, yet only 4% of physicians, 4% of cardiologists, less than 2% of cardiac surgeons are African American. So, how do we improve upon that number, and what kinds of barriers do you see in your training and education that contribute to the fact that we don't have a lot of African Americans or Hispanics or Asian Americans who are in these kinds of cardiovascular related fields?
So again, great question. And what I'll say is I wish I had the exact answer, right? Because it's so important to have it. But what I often tell folks is in healthcare, there are two pathways. So we'll talk about the first one. There are three P's that really drive change in healthcare. So the first P are your patients, right? Or the people. And that's what compelled your group to really create this program. So that's that P. Then the next P is the provider, right? And so we are kind of the liaisons between our patients and what we call total health or being healthy. And the third P is policy, right? And so to your question, you said, well, Dr. Betts, why don't we have this growing number? What are some barriers? There's barriers at each of those levels, right? And so let's start at the first one, the people, right? When you tell someone, hey, to be a cardiologist, it will take you, of course, 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, 3 years of internal medicine, and 3 more years of subspecialty training. At that point, their eyes get big and they say, you know what? I don't know if that's for me. And you see that holds true with programs that the Association of Black Cardiologists does. So I happen to be the co-chair of a program called PULSE, or Pre-College Undergraduate Life Science Initiative. All you have to do is show up. You get to meet medical school admissions officers. You get to meet other physicians. You get to do that. We had the event completely free. We had empty seats. And again, that's the people issue. But then there's this thought that maybe I'm not smart enough. Maybe, I know how much medicine costs. So there's that there. So then what about the providers, right? What about, because providers have the opportunity to pivot, where there's this whole discussion, and not that we want to get off into the weeds of, well, people don't choose cardiology because there's this thought that you can't live well, meaning you live well, but that work-life balance is off. And there's some concerns from a litigious standpoint, especially that varies from state to state. But, we're here to say you can, enjoy yourself in the community, have a delightful family life, have that work-life balance, but people don't see that. That's not what's messaged. And then that final P that limits creating this diversity is policy, right? And this is where I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, but when you eliminate funding for programs that prompt diversity, don't force it, but that prompt it, understanding that when you build diversity, it allows, there's a program that I have called Defending Your Turf, TIRF, for companies. And you say, well, what are you talking about? Well, when you defend your turf, diversity increases talent, that's your T. Number two, it enhances innovation, that's your I. Number three, it improves our recruitment. And then when you look at it, F, it enhances finance. It improves your bottom line when you engage in diversity and creating diversity programs. But when policies are created at the highest level, it doesn't matter at the two lower levels, at the physician level, and then on to the patient level, where you can have issues to improve how you do moving forward. So until we start to break those barriers down, and I think your program, how it goes out into the community and shows people we care at the provider level, and then start to make conversations to drive, you guessed it, policy change, right? Because until that policy change happens, at some point, it's going to be tough to keep developing Dr. Kellers. It's going to be tough to keep not to say that you're ever going to stop. You won't. But at some point, we have to transition into making policy that's sustainable and that's realistic, and we can apply it to that, so that diversity isn't just this 5-year, 10-year plan. It is a longitudinal idea to enhance healthcare in a broader community.
Well, that brings to mind a very important question that I would like for you to tell our audience your thoughts about the fact that applications or acceptance rates for medical school for African American and Hispanic people is going down, are going down. Acceptance rates for college, and actually the proportion of students that are college age that actually matriculate through college that come from these groups is going down. And so, how much does having African American and Hispanic and other minority figures in academic medical institutions that can sit in the room and adjudicate whether people have talent or whether they have all of these other things that you have described in a way that is culturally sensitive? How much does that matter? And do you think that that actually impacts the number of physicians that we produce that come from these groups in this country?
I like these questions. You framed it well. You walked me down the pathway. I mean, so this is where, how do I say it? This is where it's not racism, but it's bias. And you say, well, what's the difference, right? Remember, racism requires a structural, systemic process that can be either overt or covert. Bias can either be implicit or explicit. But in these rooms, it's implicit. It's what you think. It's that defense mechanism to say, man, he looks like the guy I saw in the evening news. And you say, the evening news. Remember that messaging. And so, do you want the guy on the evening news who was just seen at that store in your medical school, sitting next to your students, your daughters? And I'm saying that not from a place of fear, just to know that for many people, I look like that guy. And so it's not until people like me come into the room and show people that don't look like me, hey, look, we can be cardiologists, we can be cardiothoracic surgeons, we can be neurosurgeons, we can do all these things and still maintain connectedness with our culture. And I think, and this isn't, and I'm trying to say it as nicely as possible, you said it, I think there has to be a certain level of people being genuine who get to that space. Because something that my father used to always tell me is that, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And so typically what happens is when these rooms are there and decisions are being made and nobody's there to be that advocate, no one's there to have that discussion. And you see it, and we talked about folks getting into medical school, you see the same data. There was a study that came out, I want to say the JAHA, where they looked at academic promotions. and race, and how, well, that person does this, and so those things weigh into it. And so if you're not on that academic promotion committee, guess what? You won't get a ticket to the room. You won't get a seat at the table. And then it perpetuates this continual cycle of selecting the same people to do the same thing, just to select the
Yeah.
same people to do the same thing.
It's a great point. And, in the news lately, we've had a lot of discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and how Florida is abolishing their DEI initiatives, and a lot of other states are considering doing the same thing. And this really has an impact on whether people who come from underserved populations actually have an opportunity to be in the room. And so the proponents of abolishing DEI will say that, we don't really need Black doctors if they're not as smart as everybody else. And, white doctors can do just as good a job in the Black community as a Black doctor could. And so DEI is really not something that we should be discussing. Admission should be based on merit, plain and simple. We have had a lot of discussions over the years about affirmative action and standardized testing and how to assess whether people have the intellectual capability to be able to withstand the rigors of medical education. And so, why does having a Black doctor in a Black community matter? Because there are people who come from very reputable medical training institutions like the ones that you've gone to, and they can do a really good job with medicine and should not necessarily depend upon the cultural interactions that they have with people because it's medicine. And it's A plus B equals C, just as you described earlier. So why does that matter? Why do we need to have Black doctors in Black communities, and why should we continue to make an effort to have diversity in medical education and in the medical workforce?
So again, a great question, and I wish medicine was A plus B equals C, right? I wish it was. I wish medicine was so easy that a caveman could do. I wish it were that simple, but it is not, right? Meaning there is this component of medicine, and we found out in the space of growing AI, right? So artificial intelligence, and what we know is that if you plug in the same symptoms for the same person and you leave race out, AI will give you the same answer, and they're going to be right many times. However, when you start to institute race or gender or sex into the equation, it changes it, because AI is based on data that it pulls from the internet, data that it pulls everywhere. Guess what? That data is wrought with bias, right? So now
Mm.
when you take those folks that have learned in that system, even from because that is a computer, there is data that says AI is biased, right? Which is crazy, right? But it learns from us. So now you take a person who is more apt, right, to say yes versus no, to say no versus yes, right? Now you take a person and introduce them into that space. The only equalizer, and this is me saying this, and this is just how I feel because I see it every day. The only equalizer is emotional intelligence, is
Mm.
connectedness, is being able to say, I empathize with you because I had a shared experience. That's the only thing that can change ED doctor's idea when a patient comes in and says, I have chest pain, and she's an African-American female, and he says, well, she may have too much stress. She may have this, as opposed to saying she might actually have a heart attack. It's the same
Mhm.
thing that occurs when we look at studies about pain, right? And this is one of the ones that hurts my heart, where they looked at babies, children that came into the hospital with appendix issues. Painful. I'm not a surgeon, but I know they're painful. And they looked at an objective measure to say who got more pain meds. Well, if you were Black or brown, you got less pain meds because there's this bias, this implicit
Mhm.
bias towards you can tolerate pain better. So now extrapolate that to a community that sees a physician, and I don't think the physician is bad by any means. I don't think it is kind of this intrinsic idea where we make decisions on an unconscious level, and that's the scary part. because you don't know that someone's being biased. You said it, you said it beautifully, and I might get a shirt made. We don't know what we don't know. So
Hmm.
when my patients go and they see a doctor and he says, "Oh no, your blood pressure is good. Oh no, that's fine," they think they're all right. And then when they come to see me and I tell them, "Hey, you've got kidney disease, you've got this, you could have you seen?" Yeah, I saw my primary care, but he said that was normal for African. No, that's not right. And so it's
Hmm.
those things that I think allow us to make those special connections. And it's not isolated to African Americans. I mean, there are certain patients, I mean, I know we're talking about race and race matters, but there are certain patients from a class standpoint where when you
Hmm.
can't relate to the fact that making the decision to, buy your Jardiance or pay your light bill, guess what?
Right.
I'm not going to have some
Exactly.
Jardiance.
Right.
I'm going to have my
Or
lights on.
feed your
And
kids,
or feed your
or
kids,
take your
right?
Jardins. Right.
And
Or
there's
take
that.
5 buses to get to the
Keep
doctor,
on, keep
or
on.
have your Jardians, and those kinds of things.
Exactly. And
You
that's where
know,
those shared experiences kind of matter in that sense. Go ahead.
yeah, and I heard Denzel Washington tell a story one time that resonated with me, and it wasn't necessarily about medicine, but it really did kind of break down the nuances, cultural nuances that people have in their interactions with each other, and the importance of those nuances. And briefly, I'll tell the story. And I owe Denzel for letting me use this story, even though he doesn't know I've been using it, because I think it really does break down how people perceive differences, cultural differences, in a way that everybody can understand. So he said there were 2 movies that were made. One was called Schindler's List, and the other one was called Goodfellas. Everyone will remember these movies because they were wildly successful movies, won a lot of awards, and really did resonate with people in all racial and ethnic groups. Steven Spielberg directed Schindler's List, and Martin Scorsese directed Goodfellas. And they're both very accomplished directors and have had amazing careers. Some would say they're at the top of the field because they have been just that remarkable in their careers. And if you would have asked Scorsese to direct Schindler's List and Spielberg to direct Goodfellas, neither one of them would have been able to convey the cultural nuances that were conveyed without words in the making of those films so that they would have the same significance to the groups that they were talking about. And so you can say the same thing about medical care. That if you have a white doctor in a Black community who has not lived the experience of being a Black person in a Black community, then there are subtle things that they may not be able to pick up on that could impact patients' cardiovascular health care pretty significantly. And when you look at it with the example of the movies and apply it to medical care, it helps people understand the relevance of shared lived experiences and how that can impact medical care. I think it's a really powerful example.
Mhm.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, like we said, I mean, I think that cultural experience, that lived experience, that shared understanding, the ability to relate outside of the books, and I think
Mhm.
that is, medicine is science, but it's the application of the art of medicine that kind of takes it to the next level, right? That allows patients to open up in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. And like I say, I see it every day. And now part of it is I've had the pleasure of being a physician in my, institution for now 20 years. One of my patients reminded me, when I met you, you had hair. I said, gee, thanks for the compliment. I don't, so but it let me
Excellent.
know that they appreciated that I'd been there for a while. I don't know, but no, we have that relationship. It's I have a great time. And like I say, I love I love what I do, and part of it is because I can relate. I can ask them about their garden. I can ask them about, last month was colorectal cancer awareness month and National Nutrition Month, and so I put
Mhm.
a message out about soul food. And it created a conversation amongst my patients to say, well, are you saying soul food is bad? I said, well, no, I like the connectedness and what it does. However, I don't like the health implications. You know, there was the Regards trial that came out of the University of Alabama, Birmingham, where we know that the Southern diet, which is fried foods, sweetened drinks, and sugary things like that, you know, led to a 50% increase in heart disease, 40% increase in kidney disease, death from kidney disease, and a 30% increase in stroke. Right. And that was largely a study that looked
Mm.
at the regional differences in diet. Right. Now, what if a physician were in those places to still have that conversation to say, hey, look, I remember eating the same things, but this is how you can shift that into a more healthy option. Right. Not saying we take all those numbers away, but it certainly will create a conversation. Whereas if you can't connect and
Mm.
there's no understanding of what that part of the culture means, how do you
Mhm.
engage, right? And I'm not saying people can't, but I'm just saying it's a hurdle that if you're not willing to make that emotional investment, then it's going to be a challenge, I think.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good point. You know, one of the things I think that one of the reasons I'm so happy to have you on the show today is that you're a G man. You work for the government, right?
That
At
is
least
true.
you did. And
Still do.
so, and one of the pillars that you discussed in the beginning of our talk was policy. So I would like to get for you, if you could, give us uh, kind of a brief overview of the historical underpinnings of health policy in America, specifically as it relates to minorities, all the way from Reconstruction and Civil War up through the Great Migration. You know, there have been a number of health policies that have really impacted African American people, not the least of which is the Affordable Care Act, which everyone should be familiar with now. So, just give us your perspective on um, whether those government policies have helped or hurt, whether you think they've been enough or not enough, and where you think that we could do better with regard to policy.
Ooh, this is a tough one. This is one where I got to lock. I got to put my professor hat on this one. So
Yes,
let's
thank you.
start.
We're
Let's start
grateful.
post Reconstruction, right? So everyone's familiar kind of with that post Reconstruction era where there was actually two schools of thought. One school of thought was, well, let's stay where we are. It is a stable environment. There were monies allocated by the government. Now, how they were distributed, that's a whole nother discussion. And there was another school of thought that said, we're getting out of here, we're going north. And that actually creates the foundation for where we are today, right? Those two groups, because the government realized that, well, if we do feel like we need to do something, but what that group's needs and what that group needs is totally different. And so
Mm,
so that was the first schism that occurred. And remember, with policy decisions, when you start to have these factions, not even warring, you start to attenuate what can be given. So that's one of the
mm,
first pieces that I see from how it worked out. So let's take a city like Chicago and then Jackson, Mississippi. And the reason why I picked those two is that was where many of the folks either settled around or in. So Chicago, industrial revolution. So people were getting jobs. Now, and there was pushback, right? Because those jobs provided them to create healthcare in their community. They created the opportunity to build their own hospitals. And I say that tongue in cheek, right? And they were able to do that. Whereas in Jackson, Mississippi, the government sent funds in the hopes that, and I'm going to use a Reaganomics term, trickle down effect would occur. Well, as
mm,
we know, it didn't. But they developed autonomy in those smaller communities. Fast forward. Now we're doing pretty good, right? That there is social growth here. People are building their own communities. And then the same thing occurs down here with less funding. But now we have the Great Depression. And so now we just spanned
mm,
50 years, and what you saw was two independent pathways to develop health literacy, growth, financial literacy, and growth. And then we had this big hit that pretty much stopped the train in its tracks. Now, what saved it? Unfortunately, war, right? And so, what war
mm,
did, it normalized the playing field. It said, okay, we need all hands on deck. And if you come and fight in this war, we're going to do this. And for a brief period post that Great Depression, you start to see groups from both places benefiting from a federalized health system, right? Because medicine in the federal system is largely socialized. I know people don't want to say that, but it is
Right.
relatively equal, relatively equitable,
Mhm.
and relatively accessible, right? And so you saw a benefit, you saw a boom, then another hit, civil rights movement. And that's where we
Mhm.
said, we like what we had from the military push. Why can't we extend that to everybody? And that's where those social reforms came out, right? And
Mm.
this is that
That's
question
Lyndon
where,
Johnson. Uh-huh.
yeah, you see where I'm going. So it's a timeline.
Mhm.
And when you track this timeline, these curves kind of come together. And then this is when we start to ask the question, is it enough? Should it be enough? Should it be more? And those are questions that until we get to the Affordable Care Act, we can answer that with a resounding no, right? Because there were a host of medical schools to create doctors of color, well, I'll say Black doctors, that the funding for those, just like DEI programs now, was cut. You know, Dr.
Mm.
Melvin Echols, the lead of the ACC's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, gave our grand rounds and talked about this historical progression of, the hopes for diversity. But when those schools went away, and now I believe, you have Howard, Meharry, you have Morehouse, but outside of that, where else are they developing and putting these folks out? So when those numbers shrunk, well,
Mhm.
so did the ability to make Black doctors for Black communities in those Black spaces. So now you
Mm.
move forward again, you get Affordable Care Act. Now remember, Affordable Care Act, remember I told you those three P's? You got people, providers, and policy. It was a policy for the people, but to
Mhm.
deliver it to the people, we didn't have any connection with the
Mhm.
providers. So the people
Uh-huh.
had access, but they had access to people that weren't necessarily culturally connected. And so that's why you hadn't seen a reduction in the maternal fetal health rates. You
Mm.
hadn't seen a reduction in,
Wow.
cardiovascular disease. And not because I don't think the Affordable Care Act is beneficial. I just think that the arbiters of it might not distribute it the
Mhm.
way we need to, because you can develop policy, but if there are not people, providers to dictate and to navigate that policy for people, then the people are just going to have the policy. And I think and hopefully that's my idea around it. That's how I see it. And so that's why I try to be that provider in the middle, bringing policy to people in a fair and equitable way. And I love that your program does that and highlights, and I'm going to keep saying this, trying to know what we don't know. Right. That's the key, knowing what we don't know. So hopefully that
Yeah.
that gave some type of an overview in that space.
Wow. That is
Wow.
incredibly insightful. And I think it really does emphasize the fact that in policy decisions, it's really important to have good data coming in. And the only way we're going to have good data coming in is if we get into the community and try to uncover these obstacles to understanding exactly where we are in underserved communities, and we count rural communities in those communities too. I was in a planning meeting for a clinical trial recently, and it was a transcatheter aortic valve replacement trial, and the statement was made that transcatheter aortic valve replacement is ubiquitous. There's nobody that lives more than 50 miles from a TAVR center, and so we don't have an access problem for transcatheter aortic valve replacement.
Oh.
And you and I both know that there are cultural factors that come into play that obviate the fact that it's only 50 miles and really do uh, um, serve as a cautionary tale to looking at data and trying to understand uh, what is happening without having a cultural lens to look through.
Right.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. No, that cultural lens, it clarifies, because if you so I'm into photography. I have a small media company, and one thing in Lightroom that they have is they have this dehaze slider. Now,
Mhm.
dehaze really doesn't take the haze away, but you know what dehaze does? It's a mix of contrast and exposure. What
Mhm.
contrast does is it shows you differences. And what exposure does is it brightens or highlights. So when you mix exposure to different populations and you contrast those with things that they both see and don't see, things that they know and don't know, that's how you truly create this beautiful picture of healthcare. And so what you described is that continued process of knowing what we don't know and creating those pathways, I think is important. But like you said, if you look through that lens and you say, you know what, I'm not going to put my DHAs on, I'm just going to use these that I have, these that I was born with, you're inevitably going to make decisions that are not very, excuse the pun, insightful. There we go. So
Amen. Very well said.
Wow. I mean, it is fascinating to hear about the history of the marginalization of these minority populations, how that has affected healthcare. And I think the biggest takeaway, besides what you just told us in relation to photography, are the three Ps, right? And that main
right.
thing of people to policy, but if you don't have the providers on board, then that's where that challenge is. That's one of those big barriers. And I think that's the best way we can really let the community know and understand why we're going out into these places, into the churches, community centers, your local health fair, because we want to be there for you, for the people, and not on this level of policy, but to really be part of that moment of those three Ps.
Mhm.
No, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. Well said.
Thank you. So I do have a couple of other questions. I wanted to jump back into the medical education aspect and what are a few steps or actions that colleges or medical schools should consider so that we can take what we've learned from history and what we've seen in statistics in medical education, but to improve those type of statistics for those minority populations.
Right, great question. And I usually try to, now remember, I'm a sports guy, so I usually try to
Mhm.
exist in acronyms. Right? That's a safe space, existing in acronyms. But there are one, two, three steps. The third one has a couple of parts. So the first step is to start earlier, right? So meaning by third grade, we typically know how a child is going to vector. So why not introduce them to the ideas of medicine, whether to, there's this saying that, oftentimes it's hard for people to believe they can be it if they don't see it. And so I have a
Mhm.
program called Jump Right In. It's where I go to elementary schools and literally I just jump around, have a good time. No, we talk about cardiology. We talk about what happens if someone collapses. I teach them some rudimentary CPR skills. And then I teach them about 95210. Hey, you need to get 9 hours of sleep, 5 servings of fresh fruits and vegetables, 2 hours of outside play, no more than 1 hour of screen time, and zero sugar sweetened best. So that at that level, I'm starting to plant the tenets of lifestyle into these, third, fourth, and fifth graders. Well, now fast forward, right? So after we've started early, now you need to make, this is gonna sound tough, normalize knowledge. What does that mean? Well, that means that we create this concept of medicine that it is this complex, you got to do. Now, you do have to put the work in. Don't get me wrong, but anything you apply yourself to, you can get. You can make it happen. And so this is a program called ECA that I have for junior high and high school called Everyone Can Assist. We do the same thing, but we elevate the knowledge and we apply it typically just like they would to sports. So we create a
Mhm.
life-saving relay where they have to jump over hurdles, run under things, and then they have to answer questions, do CPR, run back and tag. So we show them that you can have a great time, you can party, you can do all
Mhm.
those things and still learn in that process, making medicine be
That's
accessible
awesome.
to them. And then the final one is this three-part program, C3PO. So, right, you have to invest capital, you have to invest currency, and you have to overall invest the curriculum, right? And so, capital and currency. So,
Mhm.
capital is kind of this thought process behind what you want to do. Currency, I say currency, but you have to stay up to date with what they're learning, meaning teaching people how to navigate AI to answer health questions, teaching students how to navigate AI to do literature searches, teaching people how to stay current. And then finally, curriculum, building a curriculum that is alive, that is germane to what they're doing now. Right. And then the PO is the interesting part. Right. So PO means that it has to be product driven. At the end of the day, if I do anything, if I don't have something to show for it, if I can't say I helped, a student that was in Northern California, now she's in the BSMD program at Brown. If I can't say that I had one of my mentees get into every, fellowship program that he tried out for, whereas, he almost didn't get into medical school. If I can't say that, then what product am I developing? And then O, it has to be ongoing. So once they get there, don't say they've made it, hands off. Nope, that's where mentorship really digs in. So starting early, normalizing knowledge, and then creating this pathway for mentorship that follows the individual throughout the process. So hopefully that gave us a framework, an ideology,
Yeah.
and an approach to this.
So that's fantastic. So how do we scale that to places other than where you are? Because we have a lot of efforts going on all over the country. Our fraternity brother, Dr. Ronald Andrews, and
Mm-hmm.
in Baton Rouge has the medical pipeline program that he's doing that's doing some of the same things that you're doing, but really trying to encourage young people by showing them that there are many doctors that look like them that have achieved phenomenal success, that they can do it too. That's a really important thing, I think, for people to understand that, yes, it's a very difficult thing to do. But, my daddy always used to say there's no shortcut to any place worth going.
Love
So
that.
you gotta encourage people along the way because it's a difficult process, but I think it can be done, and we don't want people to have to endure the kind of a reaction that you got from your first mentor when you told him you wanted to be a doctor. He says, "Oh no, maybe not. I don't think that's going to be good for you."
Right.
Let people find their way. And the only way they're going to find their way is if you encourage them to do themselves and to be what they want to be. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about you and your program and the things that you're trying to do is you have a broad scope. You're not just worried about Dr. Batts, and you have taken up the mantle of trying to make sure that tomorrow is better than today or yesterday for a lot of young people. So we really appreciate that. We're grateful.
Yes.
No, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Batts. As our final question for today's episode, I know you just gave us basically just a magnificent runway of how we can improve medical education from the third grade, starting all the way back there. But what is a piece of advice that you'd like to tell our community members that are particularly looking into their future of going into medical education, those future physicians, future cardiologists? Cardiovascular care in those type of fields, what can you let them know?
Well,
Mhm.
so first off, let me thank you both for having me on. This has been an enjoyable experience, and you all made me kind of pull back the history lesson and to pull back things that I wasn't expecting. But that's what happened when you surround yourself with good people that are like-minded. It forces you to grow, right? It forces you to birth things that you hadn't birthed in a while. So thank you all for that. But answering the question about, is medicine right for you? How do I do it? What things do I do? The things that I tell everyone is I say that overall, people will incentivize what you prioritize. Meaning, when you do that, what you're doing is telling yourself, if you really want something, make those steps, take those steps. And I try to make myself as available. Dr. Keller is available, but look for people that are doing what you're doing and connect, whether it be through social media, if they go to your church. So first you have to find some connection point because it's hard to walk a path that you don't know where it starts, you don't know how it ends, and you got blinders on. The blinders are all the noise around you, on the sides of you, telling you you can't, you shouldn't, you should do something else. But once you find somebody that's walked that road, they can tell you where those stumbling blocks are. Now, a few of them, they'll let you hit because they know it's a part of growth, but it's part of
Mm.
that process that allows you to continue to move forward. So finding a good mentor. Secondly, understanding what that process looks like. What I tell folks is you can never start too early to plan the rest of your life. Sounds crazy, but people wait until junior high high school, college, and
Mhm.
then say, oh, I think I want to do X. Start thinking about where you want to go before you even start the first step to get there. Finally, I'll leave you with this. When we think about when we get into a car and we want to go somewhere, we plug it into a GPS. But you can sit there in the car all day. If you don't put a direction, if you don't put a destination in the GPS, where are you going to go? Nowhere. So it starts with understanding what your destination is, plugging into that GPS, that mentor, and allowing them to ride that road to success with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I think as a final parting thought from me is it's okay to change the destination from time to time as long as you have a goal. And I really appreciate all of your insightful wisdom, Dr. Batts. And I have not been disappointed. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of this with us because these are conversations that people want to have, but they really don't have an avenue to discuss them. So I appreciate you providing that for us
Well,
today.
that wraps up our episode for today. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Batts, Dr. Keller, for all of your insightful thoughts, us kind of going back into history and how we can look forward to the future.
Thank you for your time, Doc. I know you got a lot going on, so I
No
appreciate you
problem.
taking time for us.
Excellent.
I'll
Yes.
Thank
see
you.
you
Y'all
this
have a
weekend.
great day. See you this
All
weekend.
right. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.